Pythagoras coined the term philosopher to describe himself as a lover of Sophia, a lover of wisdom. The word carries a sense of humility. A man who describes himself as a philosopher, in the sense that Pythagoras used the term, is a man who claims not to be wise, but merely to be a lover of wisdom, personified in the mythological figure of the goddess. There's always been a second class of individual who is full of pride and book learning. They don't love Sophia. They only love the art of sophistry. They're not philosophers, but merely sophists. And the academic philosophers of today are such men. They're not philosophers at all. They just like to study arguments made by philosophers of the past, and find themselves especially drawn to the great sophists. Rather than being lovers of wisdom, at best, they're lovers of wisdom. They're lovers of philosophers. They're philophilosophirs. And perhaps even that term is too charitable. They tend to scorn the true philosophers, and prefer the works of the so-called philosophers who engage merely in sophistry. They're lovers of sophistry. Philosophists, or lovers of philosophists. Philophilosophists. I have no respect for them any more than they have any love of Sophia. The lady is nowhere to be found in academic philosophy. It is a sausage fest, and at a sausage fest, everything quickly degenerates into a pissing contest. Academic philosophy is no different. Philosophers like to use jargon when it isn't necessary. In my video on libertarianism and socialism, anyone who has heard of the Lockean proviso will recognize that I referred to it. I just never actually said the words Lockean proviso. I just discussed the concept. That's my style. I've talked about MetaEthics a lot too. I just don't often use words like MetaEthics. But the philosopher erroneously concludes that since I don't use academic jargon very much, I must not know it. So he thinks he's smarter than me. In the secret book of Job, Epilogue, the dialogue brings up the idea of duty as the basis of right and wrong. And I managed to express the idea I wanted to express without using words like deontological. Like I said, for philosophers, philosophical discussions are a pissing contest. They like to use words like that, especially with people outside of the safe space of their academic philosophy department. They love using made-up words because they know that you won't know what those words mean. And it makes them feel superior to you when you have to ask them what deontological means, and when they get to condescendingly explain it to you. Of course, the concepts are usually perfectly ordinary and easy to understand. Often they're concepts that most intelligent and curious minds have contemplated. It isn't that they've never conceived of the concept, it's just that they've never heard the made-up word that philosophers use to refer to the concept amongst themselves at their little sausage fest. They have an inferiority complex. They hear their colleagues from the science department using big Latin words that they don't understand, and they see their colleagues from the math department writing big, complex mathematical equations on the chalkboard that they don't understand, and they feel dumb. So they invent their own jargon so that no one else will understand what they're talking about either. That way they can feel smarter than other people. And there's nothing they hate more than people like me who see through their smokescreen of deliberate obfuscation. I recognize them as phonies. They aren't philosophers. They're philosophists, lovers of sophistry. They're obsessed with semantics. And I do think that words matter. I try to express ideas as clearly as possible by using language as precisely as possible. But there's a point of diminishing returns. Beyond a certain point, pedantic hair-splitting just makes it impossible to say anything about anything. Philosophists argue about the precise meaning of words until words have no meaning at all. And if words have no meaning, then how can any statement be true or false? And this, of course, is the point. Philosophists have always served the interest of the archons, who would have you confess that 2 + 2 is 5. There's nothing more rebellious than the enduring notion that 2 + 2 is 4. There is nothing tyrants fear more than moral realism. There is nothing more quintessentially Luciferian than the claim that there are universal moral laws which God himself is not exempt from, If God himself violates these moral laws, then God himself is judged according to them. We are all equal with God under the law. The proper aim of metaethics is to inquire into the basis of moral law and to understand what it is that actually makes something right or wrong. And I've discussed these kinds of questions in several videos. But because my positions on metaethical questions are radically different from the positions that are popular in academic philosophistry, the Philophilosophists thinks that I must not know anything about metaethics. Really, it's just that he has given into peer pressure, and I haven't. Certain opinions are fashionable in academic philosophy departments, and if you want to have a successful academic career in philosophy, it's best not to be too unfashionable. If you want to pass the course, you had better give the professor the answer he wants on a test, and most students want to pass. They want to get their degree, and they probably want to get published or to get a teaching position at a university. So they quickly learn what opinions are acceptable and which aren't. It doesn't necessarily pay to be unfashionable. If your professors are materialist, relativist, and nihilist, then you can bet that the majority of the class, if not the whole class, will adopt those positions. If you're an undergraduate student majoring in philosophy, are you really going to challenge your professors and basically the whole class? If you do, are you going to get good grades? Are you going to be socially ostracized? Are you going to get published? Are you going to get a teaching position at a university? And I'm not saying that philosophy majors are necessarily just being conformist. I think a lot of them are, but not all. But let's be honest about it. As an undergraduate student, are you really prepared for a debate with professors who have a PhD and a long gray beard? Even if a philosophy student has the courage to take an unpopular position in a class discussion, the professor will probably be much better at arguing for his position than the student is at arguing for his. So he will probably give up and admit defeat because he realizes that he can't win the argument against the professor. Add to this the fact that the professor is in a position of authority over him. Add to this the fact that the whole class is probably going to take the professor's side and turn against him. There's a lot of social pressure for him to conform. In addition to the fact that the professor is probably going to rip all of his arguments to shreds and hit him with arguments that he doesn't know how to respond to. I'm not an undergraduate student. I don't care about getting an A on my dissertation. I don't care about getting published. I'm not trying to become a professor. And I have no respect for authority. I'm simply a lover of wisdom. I care what's true, not what's in fashion. I'm going to read a couple of brief paragraphs in an article about ethics and metaethics from the Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy, a peer-reviewed academic resource. The term meta means after or beyond, and consequently, the notion of metaethics involves a removed or bird's-eye view of the entire project of ethics. We may define metaethics as the study of the origin and meaning of ethical concepts. When compared to normative ethics and applied ethics, the field of metaethics is the least precisely defined area of moral philosophy. It covers issues from moral semantics to moral epistemology. Two issues, though, are prominent. One, metaphysical issues concerning whether morality exists independently of humans, and two, psychological issues concerning the underlying mental basis of our moral judgments and conduct. First, I want to point out that, according to this article, metaethics is the least precisely defined area of moral philosophy. So when a philosophist keeps wanting to change the subject to metaethical questions in a moral discussion, I understand that he's just attempting to move into a less precisely defined area because he's a nihilist. He absolutely hates truth. Like all nihilists, like a vampire, he will instinctively move toward the darkest corner and crawl into the deepest hole in order to escape from the light. And he believes metaethics will offer him some shade. Second, I want to point out that the article identifies two prominent issues within metaethics: metaphysical issues and psychological issues. But I reject their definitions because it assumes a materialistic framework. From my perspective as an idealist, neither of these two issues are even intelligible. Of course, morality has a mental basis, because everything has a mental basis. All that exists are minds and ideas within minds. So the two so-called prominent issues within metaethics are both child's play for an idealist. So if a nihilist wants to argue with me about metaethics, first he has to argue with me about metaphysics. My moral philosophy proceeds from my metaphysics. Nihilists have attempted to challenge my moral philosophy by making metaethical challenges that assume a different underlying metaphysics. Unless they can prove that their metaphysics are correct, then their metaethical critique of my moral philosophy is nothing more than a semantic house of cards built on quicksand. Let's go to the next section in this article that I wanted to share. Metaphysics is the study of the kinds of things that exist in the universe. Some things in the universe are made of physical stuff, such as rocks, and perhaps other things are non-physical in nature, such as thoughts, spirits, and gods. The metaphysical component of metaethics involves discovering specifically whether moral values are eternal truths that exist in a spirit-like realm, or simply human conventions. There are two general directions that discussions of this topic take. One, otherworldly, and one, thisworldly. Notice that here again, materialism is simply assumed. Any possibility of an idealistic perspective is excluded. As I've said a few times before, my position is not that there is some immaterial substance which exists in addition to material substance. My position is that there is no material substance. And I've explained this in great depth in other videos. I'm not going to repeat the case against materialism or the case for idealism again here. But what the author of this article is simply asserting is that this world is physical. When he says thisworldly, he means physical. And when he says otherworldly, he means mental or spiritual. I fundamentally disagree with him and challenge him on his assertion. I say that this world is mental. Therefore, morality is this worldly. He has it backwards, upside down, and inside out. But if you accept his frame, then it is very difficult to argue for moral realism. I'll read the next two sections concerning the so-called otherworldly and thisworldly views. In other words, moral realism versus moral relativism. I'm going to read from the article and interject my own comments here and there. It starts, proponents of the otherworldly view typically hold that moral values are objective in the sense that they exist in a spirit-like realm beyond subjective human conventions. Obviously, he's generalizing here. As an idealist, my view is not that moral values exist in some separate mental world beyond this one. This world is the mental world in which moral values and subjective human conventions both exist. He goes on. They also hold that they are absolute or eternal in that they never change, and also that they are universal insofar as they apply to all rational creatures around the world and throughout time. The most dramatic example of this view is Plato, who is inspired by the field of mathematics. When we look at numbers and mathematical relations, such as 1 + 1 = 2, they seem to be timeless concepts that never change, and apply everywhere in the universe. Humans do not invent numbers, and humans cannot alter them. Plato explained the eternal character of mathematics by stating that they are abstract entities that exist in a spirit-like realm. He noted that moral values also are absolute truths, and thus are also abstract, spirit-like entities. In this sense, for Plato, moral values are spiritual objects. Here I mostly agree, but he makes an error when he says that numbers, or the laws of mathematics, are abstract entities that exist in a spirit-like realm, that exist beyond the physical realm. The truth is that what he mistakenly believes to be a physical world is actually of a mental and mathematical nature. All is number. It isn't that there is a non-mental and non-mathematical universe, and then a mental and mathematical universe in addition to it. The mental and mathematical universe is all there is. Mental and mathematical laws exist within this world, and are the very foundation of this world. They aren't something separate from it. Next, he goes on to lump medieval philosophers and proponents of divine command theory in with all moral realists. I've already demolished divine command theory in other videos. I've argued that the idea that an all-powerful God is the source of morality is actually not a form of moral realism at all, but a form of moral relativism. So I object to lumping it in with the moral realist position. It should either be lumped in with the relativist position, or else treated as a third category. As far as I'm concerned, we can leave it out altogether and move on to the author's second category. He says, the second, and more this-worldly approach to the metaphysical status of morality follows in the skeptical philosophical tradition, such as that articulated by Greek philosopher Sextus Empiricus, and denies the objective status of moral values. Technically, skeptics did not reject moral values themselves, but only denied that values exist as spirit-like objects, or as divine commands in the mind of God. Moral values, they argued, are strictly human inventions, a position that has since been called moral relativism. Here again, I object to describing materialist as this worldly. They are otherworldly. They believe in an other world which exists independently of minds, which is made up of some abstract substance called matter. But let's read on. There are two distinct forms of moral relativism. The first is individual relativism, which holds that individual people create their own moral standards. Friedrich Nietzsche, for example, argued that the Superman creates his or her morality distinct from, and in reaction to, the slave-like value system of the masses. This is worth commenting on. I like Nietzsche. I agree that individuals should free themselves from the slave morality of church and state power. But the ultimate slave morality is moral relativism. If morality is relative, then how could you ever say that the laws of the state or the moral standards set by the state church are wrong? And if moral relativism is true, then why should you reject one moral system in favor of another, as Nietzsche suggests? If, as he prescribes, an individual decides to create his own moral standards, what will be his criteria for deciding what values to adopt? Unless some values really are better than others, this seems like a pointless exercise. If it's all relative, then his new moral system will be no better than the old one he has cast off. So why cast it off? Why is it better to be a Superman than to be a slave if there are no objective values? Let's keep reading. The second is cultural relativism, which maintains that morality is grounded in the approval of one's society, and not simply in the preferences of individual people. In addition to espousing skepticism and relativism, this worldly approaches to the metaphysical status of morality deny the absolute and universal nature of morality, and hold instead that moral values in fact change from society to society throughout time and throughout the world. They frequently attempt to defend their position by citing examples of values that differ dramatically from one culture to another, such as attitudes about polygamy, homosexuality, and human sacrifice. I agree that behavior is often largely shaped by the approval of one's society. For example, Philophilosophists, like the author of this article, espouse the illogical and self-contradictory ideologies of nihilism and cultural relativism in order to win the approval of their professors, peers, publishers, and department heads. But this is question-begging. Why does a society approve of some behaviors and not others? Is there a reason for it? Or is it just arbitrary? Should a society adopt certain moral values and not others? Is a behavior good because society approves of it? Or does society approve of it because it's good? I'm basically just applying Euthyphro's dilemma here. If the argument disproves the notion that God's approval is the basis of right and wrong, then it also disproves the notion that social approval is the basis of right and wrong. So if morality is not just whatever society decides it is, but is something that exists independently of culture, then societies and cultures can be judged according to moral law, just like individuals can. And some cultures and societies will be more or less moral than others. Of course, this brings us back to moral epistemology and MetaEthics. I actually don't think that MetaEthics is as complicated as some people want to make it out to be. It's only a problem of incentive. If nihilists were tortured until they could come up with an argument that torture is immoral, I bet they could come up with all kinds of arguments for moral realism. If their professors and classmates were all moral realists, they would be too. Sophists will argue whatever position it's profitable for them to argue. It's been that way since the time of Socrates. Because the powers that be have always wanted to suppress knowledge of good and evil, and to keep mankind in moral ignorance, as in the Garden of Eden story, they reward sophists who can argue persuasively in favor of arbitrary moral laws which serve their interest, and they punish true philosophers who pose a threat to them by speaking persuasively in favor of true moral laws, which the rulers themselves continue to violate, and which they themselves can be judged guilty according to. I've already explained some of the incentives philosophy students have to adopt materialism, nihilism, and moral relativism. They want to please their professors and get good grades, they want to get published, they want to get the professor position at the university, and they want to be accepted by their peer group, which is made up of other individuals like them who also want to please those in authority, and who therefore put social pressure on each other, which benefits those in authority. The exception to this rule would be at Christian universities, where the same institutionalized incentive structures reward students who persuasively promote divine command theory, and punish those who pursue any other unapproved line of philosophical inquiry. As I've said earlier, both divine command theory and moral relativism serve the rulers of this world. Only moral realism threatens them. If moral realism is true, then God would be immoral for sentencing people to eternal punishment for finite crimes, or for ordering the Israelites to commit genocide against the Canaanites. But if divine command theory is true, then whatever God commands is good, and therefore obedience is good, and disobedience is bad. And in the past, the idea that kings were gods, or were appointed by God, meant that the same held true for state power. Communist dictatorships essentially offered a secular version of divine command theory. Authoritarian governments can substitute some fuzzy concept of the general will in place of the divine will, and call themselves a democratic republic. Or they can substitute some vague concept of the common good in place of the divine will and call themselves a socialist republic. In theory, the collective takes the place of God, but in practice, the government rules on behalf of the collective, just as kings and priests ruled on behalf of God in the past. But the danger with this new form of enslavement is that it requires the slaves to believe that they're free. In the past, this wasn't a problem. They were told that they were slaves, and that they existed to serve God. In other words, to serve the rulers that God had placed over them. Although I've criticized the Christian religion, which has been hijacked by the rulers of humanity, it helped to smash the old power structure. The idea that God is a loving Father, and that we are His children, who He desires to have a personal relationship with, the idea that He became a man and suffered and died on our behalf, the idea that the Holy Spirit dwells within all who freely receive it, and the idea that His laws are written in a book which can be read by anyone, were truly revolutionary ideas. Obviously, I'm speaking primarily of post-Reformation Protestant Christianity. But of course, Gnostic ideas and suppressed forms of early Christianity were obviously even more revolutionary. I don't want to go down that rabbit hole, though. My main point is that divine command theory doesn't serve the same purpose that it once did, because people's ideas about God and religion have changed in the West. and a growing number of Westerners no longer even believe in God. They're no longer as willing to believe that their kings have a divine right to rule, much less that their rulers are actually gods. So the illusion of self-rule is necessary. This is where democracy and communism come in. But unless moral realism is destroyed, there's still the very real danger that the people might see that the communist dictator or the democratically elected representatives who claim to be governing according to the common good are actually not. But if good is relative, then who's to say they're not? And for nihilists, power ends up replacing moral absolutes. So we're essentially right back to divine command theory under a different mask. And in a way, it's far more elegant. Under divine command theory and the divine right of kings, obedience to the rulers was morally right, and disobedience was morally wrong. But since this slave morality was ultimately rooted in divine power, the morality of divine law was really just circular and superfluous. Why not apply Occam's razor and do away with the problematic concept of morality altogether, right? All that matters is power. Brilliant. Absolutely brilliant. Brilliant on the part of the rulers, I mean. If you buy it, you're the opposite of brilliant. I don't think any argument in defense of moral realism could ever convince the rulers, or their minions, such as the professional academic pseudo-philosophers whose jobs it is to give persuasive arguments that offer an intellectual foundation to support state propaganda. You'll never convince a snake oil salesman that you shouldn't buy his snake oil. His job is to sell you snake oil. He isn't interested in honestly determining whether or not you should. He's interested in convincing you that you should buy as much snake oil as he can talk you into buying from him, and overcoming any objections that you might throw at him. Snake oil salesmen and academic philosophers are both bullshit artists. And our institutions of higher learning are committed to churning out the best bullshit artists they can manufacture. They're not interested in producing real philosophers. So the only real philosophers are autodidacts like me. I may not be as polished as one of these professional sophists. A sophist gets to polish his craft full time. It's all he does. That's what an academic philosopher is. It's a guy that gets paid to sit around all day, working on his snake oil sales pitch. A philosopher is usually broke and struggling to get by. He works a job or maybe 2 or 3. If he's lucky, he doesn't have a family to take care of. If he does, forget about it. When is he going to have time to practice his craft? He doesn't have the luxury of sitting around all day getting paid to deconstruct the snake oil salesman's pitch. So it's never going to be an even match. But the philosopher has an inner light that's greater than the darkness that surrounds him. I'm not afraid of any argument any sophist has to throw at me. I've talked about a lot of stuff so far. I've talked about what I call philophilosophists or Philophilosophists. I also wanted to talk about what I call MetaEthics. I've already talked about MetaEthics. And the basic questions of MetaEthics and moral epistemology are questions I've dealt with a lot in past videos. What is it that makes something right or wrong? How do we know what's right and wrong? These are questions I've been intensely interested in since I was a little kid. And in a sense, these are childlike questions. Children always ask why. No matter what answer you give, they'll ask you the reason for that too. When you explain the reason for that, they'll ask you the reason for it too. They'll keep asking you why, until you eventually don't know. God was probably invented by the frustrated parents of a curious child in an effort to put an end to their questioning. But then the child asks, where did God come from? He must have come from MetaGod. If our morality comes from God, then God's morality must have come from MetaGod. No matter what circle you draw, someone else can come along and draw a bigger circle around it. You can turn almost anything into an infinite regress. For me, it makes sense that reality is like that. because I believe that existence is mental, and mind is unextended and dimensionless. It occupies no space. Space is a mental construct. If anyone disagrees with this, I challenge you to prove that space exists independently of mental perception. Voltaire famously said that God is a circle, whose center is everywhere and circumference nowhere. You might also say that God is a dimensionless point, which emanates a sphere which has a radius of infinity. Yet the radius is a line, and a line is made of points, and an infinite line is made of an infinite number of points, every one of which is God. The all is the circle around which no other circle can be drawn. Its center is the point at which every infinite radius, or every infinite regress, meets. Every infinite regress argument proves the existence of the infinite. Infinity cannot exist unless existence is dimensionless. Whatever has dimensions has limits. Whatever is material is defined as having mass and volume. If the universe is material, it must have limits. It must have mass and volume. But if the universe is infinite, it has no limits. It has no mass and volume. It's dimensionless. It's unextended. It's immaterial. It's mental. But an infinite mind can contain infinite thoughts. Those infinite thoughts can take an infinite number of forms. And dimensional space is a mental construct that allows an infinite mind to represent an infinite number of thoughts in an infinite number of forms. This is what we call the physical universe. It's made of the same stuff as dreams are made of. This is the ultimate conclusion of idealism. Nihilism is the ultimate conclusion of materialism. Ironically, nihilism is right in a sense, but nihilists remain ignorant of the profound truth to which nihilism points. Illumination is imminent for the nihilist, but the night is darkest just before the dawn, and nihilism is the darkest philosophy. This is why I advocate atheism as a path to God. In the same way, moral relativism may be the shortest path to the attainment of the knowledge of good and evil, and the rulers of this world are promoting it. They are hastening their own destruction in an attempt to cling to their power. I'm just here to watch their walls crumble. It's the same with moral relativists who seek to destroy moral realism by asking metaethical questions. They're only destroying their own position. By appealing to an infinite regress argument, they're proving the existence of the infinite, which is the foundation of moral realism. So challenge me. Defeat your own arguments. Prove my point for me while I sit back and watch. Let's assume that a moral relativist is tied up and tortured until he can come up with a reason why his torturer should stop torturing him. If there are no moral absolutes, then of course he can't object to being tortured. If he admits that torture is wrong, then he won't be tortured. At first, he'll be prideful and will try to resist giving in and screaming out in pain. But in time, he'll begin to scream in pain. Soon afterwards, he'll beg his torturer to stop. But why? His pain is only subjective. But of course for him, it's the only thing that's real. Nothing else exists but his mental experience of pain, and he wants it to stop. But why? Why should a person not value pain over pleasure? Isn't it all relative? Aren't all values merely the creation of humans? So why doesn't he choose to value pain over pleasure? Then everything would be fine. But he can't. Pain is bad. It just is. It is a fact of existence. Could it be otherwise? It doesn't matter. It is what it is. And it's like this for everyone. Suddenly he understands. The torturer wouldn't want to be tortured either. A world in which torture is permissible is a world in which the torturer could be tortured. The torturer doesn't want to be tortured. Therefore, the torturer doesn't want to live in a world where torture is permissible. Therefore, the torturer doesn't want to torture. Because to desire to torture is to desire to be in a world in which torture is permissible. But someone might object here and ask, well, couldn't the torturer desire to live in a world in which it's permissible for him to torture others, but not permissible for others to torture him? But is such a world possible? More importantly, is this such a world? It is not. In this world, when a person violates moral law, that person incurs the wrath of others. In the Republic, Socrates tries to give an answer to the question of why a person should be just if they have the power to be unjust. If they can get away with being unjust, then why should they be just? Socrates answers this in his own way, and it's a good answer. If you haven't read the Republic, read it. I'm going to give another answer, though. In the abstract, maybe there isn't a good answer to this, but we live in the real world. So it's an interesting exercise to ask, hypothetically, if you could get away with injustice, why should you be just? But we don't live in a hypothetical scenario. We live in reality. So the real question is, can you get away with injustice? I don't think you can. So it's pointless to ask such hypothetical questions. Look at tyrants throughout history. Look at what happened to Gaddafi. Look at what happened to Hussein. Look at what happened to Mussolini. People don't want to be tortured. People don't want to be slaves. People don't want to be exploited. If you oppress people, they will rise up against you. If you commit injustice against the people and inflict suffering upon them, they will rise up against you. They will desire revenge. It is an objective truth. It is the way reality is. You can't change this law. You are subject to it. If you cheat people, people won't trust you. They won't buy from you or sell to you. You'll starve to death. If you rape a girl, her father or her brothers will come and beat you up and maybe kill you. If she doesn't have a father or brothers, then other men in the community will come and beat you up and maybe kill you. Because they know that if you will rape her, you may rape one of their sisters or daughters too. And they want to prevent that. So they don't want any rapist in their community. So if there is a rapist, they will set an example. And if the men won't come for you, the women will. None of them want to be raped. So if anyone rapes one of them, they will all make sure it never happens again. So if someone wants to steal without being stolen from, or if someone wants to murder without being murdered, or if someone wants to do to others what he wouldn't want done to him, he will need an army. He will need a monopoly on the use of violence. In other words, it's necessary for a government to exist. And it's necessary for him to run the government. He has to become a dictator. But he himself wouldn't want to live under a dictator such as himself. Neither would anyone else. Everyone else will resist living under such a dictatorship. Maybe for a while he will manage to hold on to power. But the longer he holds on, the more the pressure builds. And the more the pressure builds, the worse it will be when it explodes. I don't subscribe to any simplistic notions of karma, but every action creates an equal and opposite reaction. Morality is the study of cause and effect. It's interesting that many moral nihilists appeal to Hume's argument that you can never derive an ought from an is. Of course, Hume also argued against causality in the same way. You can never prove causation based on correlation. Yet every ought is, in fact, derived from an is, just as every effect is derived from a cause. Reality is unconcerned with our inability to comprehend its inner workings. The law of causality and moral law continue to govern the world in which we live. Whether or not you can provide a mathematical proof for the Pythagorean theorem, it still holds true. Whether or not scientists can explain what caused the Big Bang, here we are. In the same way, metaethical arguments are ultimately irrelevant to the existence of moral law. Moral nihilists will sometimes say that morality isn't objective because it's referential. I say it is objective because it's referential. Morality refers to objective truths about the conscious experience of suffering and well-being. If it weren't referential, it would be arbitrary. If someone pokes you in the eye with a sharp stick, the wrongness of the action is found in reference to the pain it causes you and the loss of vision that results. So what? How does that prove moral relativism? Then I've also heard the stupid argument that morality is contingent. It's only bad to be poked in the eye with a sharp stick if you don't want to be poked in the eye with a sharp stick. This is simply idiotic. Who wants that? But I'm going to try very hard to play devil's advocate here. They might respond that they don't want their eye poked out with a sharp stick, but when I say that it's wrong for them to poke someone else's eye out with a sharp stick, I'm wrong. They'll admit that it's true that poking someone else's eye out with a sharp stick will cause them pain. The pain may be a fact, but this is merely a descriptive statement. And a descriptive statement can't prove a prescriptive statement. Really? It can't? So if a doctor makes a descriptive statement that you have a bacterial infection, that isn't a rational justification for him to prescribe antibiotics? I think it is. You can get an ought from an is. The prescriptive statement, you should take antibiotics, logically follows from the descriptive statement, you have a serious bacterial infection. If you can't see the connection between the two, then philosophy isn't for you. I don't think most people are so dense. Let's break this down. You have a bacterial infection. Fact. If left untreated, the infection will spread and become potentially life-threatening and result in suffering. Fact. You want to live and want to avoid or minimize suffering. Fact. Well, actually, this is the one point in the chain where someone might possibly object. I'll come back to it. Taking the antibiotics will cure the infection, or at the very least, significantly decrease your odds of experiencing suffering and death as a result of choosing not to treat the infection. Fact. So where's the problem in saying that you should take the antibiotics? As I've said, there's only one potential hole. What if the person doesn't want to live? Then they have a psychological illness, which is essentially no different from the bacterial infection. Both should be treated. The descriptive statement that someone has suicidal depression is logically connected to the prescriptive statement that they should take antidepressants and see a therapist. If someone wants to make a metaethical type of argument and ask why it's good to want to live and not to want to die, then I can play that game too. I'm not even going to try to give them a logical answer, because like a little kid, if I give them a reason why, they're just going to ask me to justify that reason. This is like the presuppositional apologist who keeps asking, and how do you know that? It all leads back to the one. I'm comfortable with infinite regress. It supports my position, as I've explained. But when someone asks me to support my claim that something is better than something else, they're presupposing that a supported claim is better than an unsupported claim. But if you believe that all morals and values are relative, then how can you defend your belief that a supported moral judgment or value judgment is better than an unsupported one? If metaethics can ask, what is the basis of ethics? Why can't metaethics ask, what is the basis of metaethics? Why is it good to ask what makes something good? Unless MetaEthics can answer this meta-ethical question, then it's no better to ask what makes something good than to not ask. So what is the value of MetaEthics if there is no objective standard of value? And in this way, nihilism cannibalizes itself. And once the snake swallows itself from tail to head, the truth reveals itself instantaneously. And I don't give this argument as a dodge. I don't mind giving a serious answer to metaethical questions. But those answers are rooted in my metaphysics. So then the nihilist would just challenge me to prove my metaphysical position. But of course his challenge would presuppose that reality is intelligible. Asking me to give a logical argument in defense of my metaphysical position presupposes that truth can be arrived at through logic. Can he prove that the truth is logical? The claim that the truth is logical is a metaphysical claim. Can he prove his metaphysical claim that truth is logical? And even if truth can be arrived at through logic, why should I value a true belief over an untrue belief? Does the descriptive statement that something is true justify the prescriptive statement that I ought to believe it? If so, then I rest my case. You see? So if he wants to play that game, I'll play it too. I'm better at it than he is. And I'll get serious when he's ready to get serious. But I'm not going to try to give him serious answers when he's not asking serious questions. And if he claims they are serious questions, then he should be willing to answer them himself. I could go on, but I think that's enough for now. Thanks for listening. Please like, comment, share, and subscribe, and I'll see you next time.